Okay, how we doing? Week 12. This one's a little bit later than I wanted, but it's actually not a bad thing because it gives you time to get through silence, or at least most of the way through silence before you read or listen to this. So that's probably a good thing to, spoilers and whatnot. Before we begin, just housekeeping real quick. The next thing on your horizon is quiz number 3, which is due April 13th. It's going to cover both church history weeks and both silence weeks. So it's going to have 4 weeks of material that you're going to be responsible for. I've been trying to keep up to date with the quiz review sheets. Just use those, and yeah, shouldn't run into any trouble. So I am curious what you think of the book. Some of you might have seen the movie last year. I haven't seen the movie, quite frankly. I need to, but I haven't seen it yet. But I am curious to know how the book is going. That's why the reflection question this week is what it is. Just basic, reflection on the book. Did you like it? What did you like? So on and so forth. Let me just real briefly, I don't want to take a long time today, but I do want to revisit some of the themes from last week so that now that you have the book as a base, maybe they make more sense, maybe they come out a little bit stronger. Reminder about Endo, the author. He's a Japanese Catholic. He's trying to work out how his Catholicism and his ethnicity interact with each other. Talked about a borrowed tradition. Talked about the mud swamp of Japan being something that sucks in these Western traditions and leaves them unchanged, which comes up in the novel, as we'll see. How he is balancing that, walking that tightrope between what his identity is as a Christian, as a Catholic, and what his identity is as a Japanese citizen, how that works. And I think that one of the questions I asked you in a previous discussion was, do you see America as predominantly, or do you see Christianity as predominantly a Western American phenomenon or not? And how does the relationship between faith and nationalistic impulse play itself out? So we talked about him, we talked about the Jesuits and the missionary impulse, how the missionaries do extraordinary things as an outworking of their belief system. They do extraordinary things in the service of their calling because they believe the truth of Christianity is universal. Everyone who believes is going to heaven, Japanese, Portuguese, whatever. And conversely, everyone who does not hear the gospel and does not subscribe to Christianity is headed for the other place, headed for damnation. That's a powerful motivator, as we talked about. And it's a powerful motivator to make men like our characters in this novel do the things that they do. We talked about global politics and how sometimes that intertwines in not so nice ways with the missionary impulse. Very hard to separate these missionaries, from the Japanese perspective, very hard to separate these missionaries from their nations. Portuguese interest. In a lot of cases, the missionaries were considered to be almost a front for the national interest. Like they would clear the way with their missionary work, and the national interest would sneak right in behind it. That's what the Japanese leaders were clearly afraid of and taking pains to deal with. We talked about pride. We talked about nationalistic pride, triumphalist pride. Rodriguez, he is interesting because he has in the beginning, in the first half of the book, he has a certain vision of what a life of a missionary priest is supposed to be like, and it's marked by success. I mean, that's the only way to put it. It's marked by success for his Savior. We're going to come in here, we're going to plant this church in Japan, and Japan is going to be taken over for Christ. And I am going to be the esteemed missionary priest who has played a role in this process. I will be a good Christian. I will be a good missionary. It's triumphalist. For him, it's all about success. And did we win? Did we overcome those who stood against us? But that point of view falls by the wayside in light of another thing that we talked about last week: suffering. There's a lot of suffering in this book. This book's not the easiest to get through. You probably already figured that out. In suffering, you have something that is an evergreen topic, talking about Christianity, because there's always been Christians dealing with suffering. And how can a good God allow suffering? And how can a religion that promises ultimate victory handle so much going wrong in the here and now? And you get a glimpse of that if you've ever listened to some of the the spirituals that were sang in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. You hear glimpses of that. You get a little bit of that here in this book, with the Japanese Christians singing the song, "We're on our way, we're on our way, we're on our way to the temple of paradise." So how do you deal with suffering? A very common way is to Think about what's coming. Think about hope in hope in the future, and maybe downplay life in the present reality. So you think about how do you deal with a hellish situation on earth. You maybe think about the heaven that lies behind it. And this has been a very common refrain throughout Christian history. How do you deal with suffering? How do you deal with hardship? It's one of the reasons I think that this religion has always flourished in places where hardship and suffering are real. It's because there is a ready-made defense against it. Sure, it's hard now. It's going to get better. Whereas folks in developed nations like Rodriguez's Portugal, like ours, we have a hard time dealing with suffering and deprivation of any kind. So, ironically, I think it presents a situation where Christianity it's harder to accept it because we have such a hard time dealing with the first step in that process. Like suffering, something must have been wrong. Clearly, my faith wasn't strong enough, or clearly something is off because I'm not supposed to experience suffering. I mean, this is I'm supposed to experience victory. And this is the battle cry for what's known as the prosperity gospel or the health and wealth gospel. Name it and claim it. The people that advocate that faith in God is proportional to outward, obvious, worldly success. In other words, if you are really strong in your faith, God's going to bless you materially. If you need a car to get back and forth to your job, all you got to do is pray hard enough for it, and it's there. I've given you a representative quote, and I really worked hard to make sure that I found a quote that was representative and wasn't just trying to prove my point. And I do believe I found one. There was a prosperity gospel embattled, controversial prosperity gospel preacher named Creflo Dollar. I promise that's his name. And what Creflo Dollar says, read what he says here. So, poverty is not the will of God for any believer. However, there are Christians who have taken a vow of poverty because they believe that poverty is a part of being holy and righteous. This is far from the truth. Poverty has nothing to do with godliness or God-likeness. To be poor or impoverished means to be without and lack deprived. You and I don't serve a God of lack and insufficiency. He is the God of exceeding and the abundant. In fact, he wants to lavish you with his goodness. I like what Dr. Leroy Thompson says, you can't think any bigger than God can deliver. So, in other words, there's no place for suffering in Creflo Dollar's theology. Because if you're suffering, then your theology is deficient. You're not doing it right. And the natural follow-up question, I think, for people like this is, how would the Japanese Christians in silence respond to this? I don't think they'd be very impressed. And there's a long litany of Christians in the history of the religion who have suffered and who have had nothing. But it has not been proven a hindrance to their faith, and it has not proven the fact that that they are deficient in any way. Just the opposite, actually. But I think this is suffering is an interesting thing, and doing it this way with this kind of clash of cultures, missionary narrative, where you have the Western world where suffering is less common, go in and you have this destination, Japan, which is kind of representative in some ways. Where Christians really, truly are suffering, you get different perspectives. And you watch how Rodriguez's perspective changes, because in the first half of the novel, he's not on Creflo Dollar's level, but he is most definitely thinking in terms of victory and thinking in terms of success. And he has that basically beaten out of him by the circumstances in Japan. And by the end, he has a very different perspective on it. Silence tells us a very different story. It does not tell us that if you pray hard enough, God will bless you materially. On the contrary, a main theme of silence, hence the title of the book, Why is God Silent When Everything is Lost? Again and again and again, Rodriguez in his diary, he's talking to God. He's saying, where are you? How come you're not speaking? How come you're not moving? How come you're not visible when your people are going through what they're going through? When they're going through the ordeal of the pit, when they're dealing with all these other things, how come you're silent? And this temptation, this sense gets cranked up to 11 when he finally meets Ferreira. They finally find Ferreira, and they have this conversation. It's a fascinating conversation. But in this conversation, Ferreira says, everything you came for, the whole vision that you had in your head of victory, of success, of Christianity, is gone. Moreover, it never was. Um, it wasn't it wasn't Christianity that took root in Japan. It was a mutated form of, it mutated into a distinctly Japanese heresy. But there was no victory for you here. There was never a chance of it. You've wasted everything. And Ferrer says you should do what I have done and try to make yourself useful in the quote-unquote swamp of Japan. You've been defeated here. Japan has defeated you, just like it's defeated every other missionary, just like it's defeated this religion and turned it into something else. Try to make the best of it. Try to make yourself useful. That is Ferrer's message to Rodriguez in a nutshell. And it's compelling. I mean, at that point, he's arrested. He's, everything he's tried has not worked. He's brought to Ferrer, and Ferrer says, yes, I was in the same position you were in. I went through the same things you did. And here's what I learned. The Christianity that you came in here representing has been defeated badly. There's nothing left for you here except to accept that and to try to find your way into a situation where you're useful. Go ahead and trample. Go ahead and and this is where our running theme throughout the novel is the fumi and how an apostasy, going away from the faith, is represented by trampling on the statue. So Ferrer says, go ahead and do it. It's not going to affect your beliefs. It's not going to affect anything here. So go ahead and do it and try to make yourself useful and try to serve these people. And it's an awful dilemma that Rodriguez finds himself in. He's going, all right, I've had this conversation with Ferrer, and quoting him on page 128, he says, am I looking for the true hidden martyrdom or just a glorious death? Is it that I want to be honored, or to be prayed to be called a saint? So he's still holding on to this idea of victory. And the interesting thing is, it would have been a lot easier. Say Rodriguez is sent to the pit and he's tortured and he dies. His vision of victory still survives, even after death. He could have held on to what he thought was his victory. He turned out to be more faithful than Kitajiro. He turned out to be more faithful than Ferreira. And that's what he's gearing up for. It's clearly what he's gearing up for in the novel. As the novel progresses, he's going, all right, I'm going to be put in the pit. I'm going to suffer, but I'm ready. I'm spiritually strong enough. I'm ready. I'm not going to I'm not going to apostatize. I'm not going to trample. I'm bringing it on. I'm ready. But then the great curveball of Silence is that they never had any intention of putting him in the pit. And if you look on page 177, where it really starts to get just gut-wrenching. He's in a cell, and he's waiting. He's expecting to be thrown into the pit at any moment. And then on page 177, you see what happens. He hears the noise, and hears the noise, and hears the noise. Page 177, let's see. It's only that snoring, answered the priest through the darkness. Suddenly the interpreter became silent as if in astonishment. You think that's snoring? Solano, did you hear what he said? He thought that sound was snoring. The priest had not known that Ferreira was standing beside the interpreter. Solano, tell him what it is. The priest heard the voice of Ferreira, the voice that he had heard every day long ago. It was low and pitiful. That's not snoring. That is the moaning of Christians hanging in the pits. The great curveball here is that he's not the one who goes into the pit, is tortured and dies. He could have held on to his victory, his idea of victory, if he did that. The Japanese Christians are put into the pits, and they've already apostatized many times. But it doesn't matter, because they're put in the pit for him to apostatize. You apostatize, or these people continue to suffer. So what does victory look like now? Does it look like hanging to your faith and being strong and not apostatizing? Or does it look like taking the suffering of these people into account and apostatizing? And that's exactly what Ferreira says. If you look later down that page, he tells Rodriguez, certainly Christ would have apostatized for them. For love, Christ would have apostatized, even if it meant giving up everything he had. I mean, thinking about that, how could Christ apostatizing? The perfect Son of God, Savior Christ, renouncing the faith? How is that even possible? But that's exactly what Ferrer said would happen. in order to show love and to relieve their suffering, he would have given up everything he had. He would have given, including his vision of purity, his vision of victory. For Christ, love trumps everything else. And Ferrer says to Rodriguez, you need to do that too. He's taking it like the voice of the enemy. But at the same time, he is ultimately, he can't see what else to do. So he's finally going to trample. He's finally going to do it. Ferrer is encouraging him. Says, you are now going to perform the most painful act of love that has ever been performed. Because Ferrer knows what's at stake here. He knows what it is for a missionary priest to renounce the faith. You've renounced everything. You've renounced status in the church. You'll never be able to show your face in Portugal again. You've renounced all of your self-identity as as the strong one who held out to the very end. And also, we talked in previous lectures about Christianity being a powerful identity marker. You lose right to that too. You lose everything. And still, Jesus is silent. And still, he is not speaking. Even when he is about to, Rodriguez finds himself forced to abandon everything, to abandon his theology, to become just like Ferrer and Kichijiro, to take this epic loss, if you will. It's an impossible situation. What is he going to do? And find, Jesus is not speaking until finally he does. And when Jesus speaks, there's no more silence. And finally, this is what he says. He says, trample, trample. I more than anyone know the pain in your foot. Trample. It was to be trampled on by men that I was born into this world. It was to share men's pain that I carried my cross. The message comes through, and the message is, yes, you carry the pain of others, even at the expense of everything else. That's what this is. That's what this religion is. That's what I'm about. That's what you are to do. And as you can imagine, this was screamingly controversial in Japan, and it still is. Because when you think about what Jesus would have you do, renounce your theological beliefs, it's probably not very high on that list. But it's a very distinctive point that the author here is making. He's saying what matters more than anything else is redemptive love. Following Jesus in his mission. What was his mission? To redeem sinners. And that's what, according to the author, that's what Rodriguez must do as well. So all hope seems lost. He becomes known as apostate Paul. He does reconcile with Kichijiro, which is beautiful, but at the same time, all right, he's apostate Paul. Ferrer is apostate Peter. They're living in Japan. He's married to a Japanese spouse, living in Japan. Like, all right, a priest gets married. Think about that for a minute. Now what? And you get this really weird chapter in chapter 10, which is basically just notes. Because one of the things about silence, which is fun, is the fact that there's a lot of different literary styles represented. There's like notes, there's straightforward narrative, there's diary entries, there's all sorts of things. But chapter 10, it's well hidden, but there's a sneaky little message in there that the apostate Paul and his servant Kichijiro are still involved in church work. They are still doing. It's under wraps, obviously, but the church is not dead yet. It is still present in Japan, and even after his apostasy and Kichijiro's apostasy, they are playing a role in this new flowering. Is not even the right word. It's too strong of a word. But the fact that the faith is not dead, when silence ends, the faith is not dead. It's hanging on, and it is going to continue to be strong. And from Endo's perspective, think about his perspective. Of course, it's not dead because this grows into the faith that converted Endo into a Catholic in the first place. I mean, if the faith had completely died, there would be no Endo writing this novel. So it's an interesting way for the book to end. Really subtle, but really interesting. So what does victory mean then? Victory is not being the missionary priest who is the awesome Christian. What is it? I think Endo's saying it's participating with Christ in redemptive suffering. There's a long quote here. It's from a man named Brett Dewey. Forgive me for the length, but I think this really gets it. In trampling the Fumi, Rodriguez frees the peasants. It is an action partaking in the action of God which bears hopeful fruit among the people. In taking foot to face and trotting on the image of the Savior, Rodriguez is not committing apostasy. Instead, he is affirming the vocation of Christ. He is partaking in divine mission. Rodriguez sacrifices himself, including his pride and place as an upstanding member of the clergy, in order to participate with God in a redemptive suffering that seeks the ultimate liberation of the peasantry. So he tramples. But this trampling hurts. It's not just a formality, as the translator would hope us to think. Endo writes, the priest raises his foot. In it he feels a dull, heavy pain. This is no mere formality. He will now trample on what he has considered the most beautiful thing in his life, on what he has believed most pure, on what is filled with the ideals and the dreams of man. Endo concludes how his foot aches. Suffering the victory of God hurts and implies a divine patience and victory that rests not on societal fixes or divine fiat, but on human participation in the long suffering of God. Grace and nature are one. Our history is participation in salvation history. Salvation is now in suffering, not political parties, government structures, our future-oriented hopes. So defeat becomes victory. That sounds familiar. If you think about the story of Jesus in the Gospels and how crucifixion leads to ultimate victory, that is the Christian narrative. Suffering is the road to victory, but it's not a triumphalist victory. It's not a chest-beating victory. It's not an "aren't I awesome" victory. It's a victory on behalf of others, for others. It is a selfless, painful victory because it's truly a sacrifice. You're truly giving something up. It doesn't square very well with a lot of the language that we've heard, especially out of the evangelical camp, over the course of the past presidential elections. And even today, some Christians talk about winning the country back. And by that, they mean kind of a more forceful victory in the quote-unquote culture wars. If only we could win on abortion and stack the Supreme Court with pro-life justices. If only we could win on the issues we care about. Then that would create the situation for God to be present and be active in the country. Silence would seem to argue the exact opposite, that suffering and utter defeat in every capacity is what paves the road to ultimate victory. Because that's the story of the Gospels, it's the story of Jesus. That's the story of Christianity. So here's the bottom line. Jesus is moving in the world, Jesus is active, Jesus is victorious, but through persecution, suffering, and weakness. Because the victory that we tend to see as victory, as human beings tend to see as victory, can get ensnared into worldly politics when that's not the side of victory that Jesus is after. He's making a different sort of kingdom, and the way in is through redemptive suffering on behalf of others. That's quite a message for a modern pluralistic world. So that's Silence in a very brief nutshell. I do hope you enjoyed the novel. We're going to move on to some other things going forward, some contemporary issues, which I'm actually really excited about. But yeah, I'm definitely going to read your reflections closely this week because I love this novel and I hope you do too. If you didn't, don't be pressured to say, yeah, I loved it because the professor wants me to say I loved it. Tell me if you didn't like it, because there's Christians that hate this novel because it paints a picture of apostasy as ultimately something that is not. It seems to cheapen apostasy if you say, well, they renounced Jesus, they renounced their theology, they renounced everything, and yet they still want to remain Christian. There are some people that have had a real problem with that. So not everyone loves Silence, not every Christian loves it, but I do, which is one of the reasons why I assigned it to you. So I'm curious to get your take on it. But yeah, don't be afraid if you didn't like it to tell me. But otherwise, yeah, I like including novels because what novels allow you to do is get to some really deep theology and get to some stuff that's really huge, but in a way that's not textbook-y. I like that. I hope you do too. So yeah, I think we'll leave it there, and we will come back again next week.